I realized when I sat down to prepare this the seminar for today, the mistake was you gave me 2 weeks instead of 1 week, right? So I realized that it was growing and growing and growing. And the consequence of that might well be that today we will do a mass in detail of our own. Let's say we'll stop before we're done. But at that point, I'll sort of ask you what you think. I'm hoping that we'll have reached the point where we can do the ascenditum in the form of the ... and leave you to finish the thought, right? Finish the sentence, so to speak. Since today we are suspended sentences day, in any case. But if not, then we'll just move it to the next week, and so the interruption will be a partial interruption, and continuity will be more or less re-established a week from now. So basically I'm thinking that there's probably time at least to get as far as talking about last tech today, and hospital time will probably be the text that remains sort of a bit in limbo, one way or another way. But let's see how we go. I plan to be fairly leisurely about it, so as not to, have that sort of breathless feeling, which is never good, I don't think. And we'll see how it turns out. So there's a longish introduction to kind of try and establish a few framework ideas, and then I want to look at the 2 poems that are in the handout. Unfortunately, rather briefly, you have to do 2 or 3 weeks of work on those poems if you want to write a dissertation on them, or something like that. And then move from there to... I'm sorry. How did I... move from there to last tech and hospital time, which are the longer, if not the more substantial text. That's a lot of stuff to do into it. General direction that I'm working on is in the idea of how everybody is under suspended sentence, obviously, how the consciousness of the suspended sentence produces a liminarity, a form of social being on the edgeness, and how both last tech and hospital time understand that liminarity in ways that I think are quite convergent. But it will take me a while to get to that. So I have an epigraph today, you lucky people. And I have 4 quotations that I'm going to just throw at you more or less to start with. And the epigraph comes from last tech, and it reads, Quelque chose d'invisible, un lien. Okay, let me just stop here, I'll put 3 dots. It says un lien sublime et secret, and so on and so on. We'll get not the whole quotation, but I'll lengthen this quotation later on. Something impossible, a link, okay? It's on page 39 of last week. But to begin with, I want to go back to the Harold Brodkey quotation that I began with, remember. The trouble with death at your doorstep is that it is happening to you. Now let me give you the following sentence. 8 weeks ago, I treated that as if you meant it is happening to readers. But he meant it in the sense that it is happening to writers, about the author. And so his next sentence is, also, that you are no longer the hero of your own story. No longer even the narrator. Barry was the hero of my story. Barry is his doctor. And Ellen, the narrator. Ellen is his wife. The tale was of my death amid others' lives. Dash, like a rock in the garden. Harold Brodkey's was a writer at the best of times, and obviously he was not writing at the best of times. So you have there the idea of death as a dispossession and passing, but at the same time of passing on of responsibility for the telling, for the continuation of the story, for the telling of the story of the dying by someone else, by another hero and another narrator, someone else who Brodsky doesn't consider this, but someone else who, in inheriting that responsibility, inherits also the sense of guilt that goes with the dispossession, of course. So my next quotation comes from Lostek, and it's about what it's like to be a survivor who has inherited the responsibility of telling the story of another person's dying death. From the end of Lostek 103. Quand deux Aztèques sont amis, le premier qui meurt est celui qui gagne. Celui qui reste se voit mourir avec l'autre, lucide, impuissant. Qui a vécu l'agonie d'un Aztèque n'a pas envie de recommencer. So, when two Aztecs are friends, the first to die is the winner. The one who remains sees himself dying along with the other, lucidly and impotently. Whoever has lived through the agony, the dying, of an Aztec doesn't feel like doing it all over. That introduces a new element, which is the idea of a kind of symmetry, if you like. To say the survivor can, in a certain sense always is, also dying, is also repeating the same story. So, this problem of repetition, which, quotation 3, Hervé Guibert expresses most strikingly in To the Friend Who Didn't Save My Life, à l'ami qui m'a pas sauvé la vie, talking about the death of Musil, the famous episodes in which he talks about the dying and the death of Michel Foucault. Comment on that. Ce n'était pas tant l'agonie de mon ami que j'étais en train de décrire que l'agonie qui m'attendait et qui serait identique. C'était désormais une certitude qu'en plus de l'amitié, nous étions liés par un sort thanatologique commun. So it wasn't so much my friend's agony, dying, that I was describing as the one that was waiting for me and which would be identical. Henceforth, my certitude was that it wasn't friendship that bound us. I'm sorry, I misread it. My certainty was that beyond the friendship that bound us, we were bound by a common thanatological fate. I think I've already used the term autothanatology on time for autothanatography. So being a survivor then is this problem of inheriting a responsibility, a problem of repetition. Finally, it's a problem in writing, how to do the writing of being a survivor with this sense of responsibility entails. How can you write the death of the other, which the other wasn't capable of writing, when you are not even that other person, but simply the observer. So this is from a text we haven't referred to before by René de Secati, which is on the list, called L'Accompagnement. Right at the beginning he says, talks about how his friend asked him to do the witnessing that he, the friend, could not do. And he says, Je vais m'efforcer de ne pas abuser de la confiance qui m'est faite, encore qu'écrire à sa place me semble un premier abus. So I'm going to try not to abuse the confidence that's placed in me, even though writing in this place looks to me like it's the very first primordial abuse of confidence. So one is not the other, one can't write this below the other. One nevertheless has a responsibility towards that other, a responsibility that in some sense at least extends to an identity with the other's faith. So those are my 4 quotations. I'll just draw your attention to the idea that this is another way of defining the problem of relay that we looked at apropos of RSVP. The problem of carrying the dead. Right? Here it is in a rhetorical form now, how do you write the dead of the other? As a response to the separation, the interruption, the gap that's been introduced by the death of the other. Can writing in any sense bridge that gap? Can writing re-establish the continuity that has been broken by death? And so the problem of relay, as I think I've already pointed out, corresponds to the structure of asyndeton. Go back up again. According to my dictionary, asyndeton part comes from the Greek verb meaning to tie together, to bind. So asyndeton is privative, a lack of tying together, an absence of binding, right? In which discourse continues beyond the break, but the break is perceptible. So the canonical examples of asyndeton are things like Julius Caesar's famous remark, which has commas in its modern form, but imagine it as an ancient Roman, he didn't use commas, where you simply have 3 verbs stuck one after the other, and you get to invent what connects them, right? Came on store, I conquered. Day in, day out. Another example of, kind of grammatical example of, what would you like an example of grammatical asyndeton rather than rhetorical asyndeton? Although Emmanuel is the one that the French dictionary is giving. Is the one that I looked up is called Emmanuel as an example of asyndeton. That happens all the time, right? The point being, however, that we want to look at forms of asyndeton that signify rather more than these grammatical ones. What strikes me about the canonical examples, though, is that there's a certain sense of fatality already represented by the examples themselves. I don't know whether that's an accident or not. Julius Caesar is saying, once I did the veiny part, then the vidi and the vici were inescapable. And the day in, day out thing is obviously very relevant to age writing in a horrible kind of way. And so is the Bongole Mongole kind of thing. Now my gloss on the idea of asyndeton would be that it takes 2 forms. One is the form in which the other picks up and continues the message, and the other is in which the message reveals itself to have had another all along, which continues it. In other words, if I make a statement and leave it at blank before I've continued it, I'm assuming that you will continue the statement, right? So you better be good tonight, or else. Would be an example of asyndeton in that case, right? But alternatively, an ace indeed can have a digressive form, as it does in these examples, as a matter of fact, right? Something is repeated, usually something, in these cases, something grammatically formal in the grammar, same type of, paradigmatically the same verb forms, right? But something emerges from the first message, veni, that turns out to have been part of that message, but it deflects the meaning. So veni implied vidi, but when vidi emerges from message 1 as message 2, it takes the form of a digression from it, because we weren't necessarily expecting that vidi was going to be the next So that's what I mean by digression. If you want to know more about digression, ask me over coffee sometime, because the work that I was doing before I started on this work was all about digression. In neither of those cases is the continuation identical with what precedes it, of course. Right? In each case, either there is a second message that emerges, or another is charged with doing continuation. So when I said, you better behave tonight or else, I might have meant, or else I'll have a nervous breakdown. Whereas what you may have understood was, you better behave tonight or else I'll get out the paddle and spank you, whatever it might be, okay? You know what I mean? There's no guarantee that the continuity, it's impossible for the continuity not to be affected by the discontinuity. But there's nevertheless a continuity. So that's this is still introductory stuff. I hope you're feeling patient today. That's the dynamic that's at work in what I call aftermath writing. That's to say, the writing of the survivor, with the broadest definition, about an atrocity that the person has survived, but in the narrow definition that I want to use for age writing of a survivor about the death of another, in which that writing is also the writing of one's own future death. So, the writing about the death of another on an assumption that the story is somehow shared. So, future death that is implied or entailed by the death that you're writing about. And there's a kind of sub-form of aftermath writings, which I call dual autobiography, which is perhaps the simplest form of aftermath writing, in which the shared story is the story of two people who were in some sense close to each other before the death, lovers, friends, relatives, whatever it might be. So two stories are told, the story of the dying and the story of the survivor. But the conviction, which is also an abus de confiance, a breach of faith, the conviction is that that is a shared story. That's a story that is not discontinuous. And so the sharing has two parts, a sense of sameness and a sense of abuse. The sameness resides in the continuity of suspended sentences, if you like to put it that way. The description of an agony as a suspended sentence aids as a death sentence not yet carried out is followed by the narrative of another suspended sentence, which is that of the survivor, who in many of these cases is also infected, to be symptomatic of things. That does not have to be, as the example of Amy Hoffman in Hospital Time. So it's what Duquesneau calls in his book his eternal deferment. It's not dialectics, it's a story of an endless deferment. And it's also something that, I think I've mentioned this before, Maurice Blanchot drew attention to a long time ago, 50 years ago, in a narrative, which is La Paix de Mort, which I thought was an untranslatable title until I came up with this suspended sentence, in which arrêt means decree, but it also means for now the decree has been, a stop has been put to the decree. So there's the sameness of the suspended sentence, the relay of one suspended sentence followed by another one. The abuse is, of course, in the fact that surviving to write the story is precisely not the same as dying or writing that dying. There's the abuse, of course. The survivor is in the after of the mass. Not the mass, but the after is also a mass. Right? With me there. Etymology, again, I gave it to you on the handout. Math is mowing. And if you have a good season and you're growing wheat or grass or something or other, you can get two mowings in the same season. So the aftermath is the second mowing after the first. Both the same and not the same. Now, very strikingly, aftermath writing, particularly in the form of your autobiography, with its own various variants, you see, the narrative can be HIV positive or not HIV positive. The emphasis can fall more on the story of the dying than on the story of the surviving. For example, Paul Manette's book, Borrowed Time. Or it can fall the other way, more on the story of surviving than on the story of the dying. But all those kinds of possibilities are inherent in it. But as a broad statement, I think it's fair to say that that's become the major genre of AIDS writing. Probably it started off more in the form of diary keeping and diary publishing, but it has now become this aftermath genre. So that's why I made a handout for you. I didn't intend to discourage you or anything, but these are the texts in that genre that I was able to come up with out of my memory, because I'm not a very methodical person when it comes to research, over a cup of coffee. Right? Then spent a couple of hours looking up the publishing details and getting the spelling right and all of that stuff. And I did that about a month ago. Well, it says January 1998. So I should mention, if I can find what I've done with it, a couple more that I've become aware of since then that you might want to write in. Thierry Mangot. Felicita Chronique. These are both published last year, and they're both in French actually. And the other one is pronounce that as best you may, Fléchouer, I will say, La vie du mort, you present. A publishing house I've never heard of before, Anne Carrière. That's the book that I was reading that led me to talk to you about the Doing Our Elegies, a little bit. That was the titles, quotation from the first elegy. So I just wanted you to see the amount of writing that there is. Sorry, Pat, can you figure it out?
I've noticed the chalk is getting paler every year.
I think it's the wrists that are beginning to give out too. I'll give it to you separately. If you have anybody that needs the details separately, I'll be happy to give them to you. There's a lot of interesting writing there. Some of it's very beautiful. Very varied. And you might want to look at some of it. So it's been important. But there are various comments about that. One is the simple amount of writing that is coming out of this particular atrocity, as opposed to the various other 20th century and earlier than 20th century plagues, epidemics, wars, genocides, etc. That there have been. Somebody needs to think about why that is happening. Another thing that I think is interesting is that the generic resemblance between many of these texts is quite striking. Many of them are short, disarticulated, episodic narratives. There are some exceptions to that, generalizations. The novels, for example, are long. John Foster's book is quite long. Paul Manet's book is quite long. Short, obviously, because it's painful to write under these conditions, under conditions of suspended sentence. The writing doesn't come easily. It lapses constantly into the sense of doing something that's impossible. Something that's a sham, something that's an abus de confiance. Failure. Disarticulated, I think, because the mode is asyndetic. It's traversed by one major interruption, which is the interruption of death, somebody's death, but by interruptions in general, which I think has to do with the fact that one keeps making fresh starts, and each fresh start turns out to be a false start, so you make another fresh start. And so it's that interruptive practice of writing that leads to what I'm calling the phenomenon of suspended sentences. Now, this time in the linguistic or grammatical sense of the term, not in the metaphysical sense at all, which I think was signalled. Duquesnel's book has certain kind of originary status. It's one of the classics, early classics of this particular genre, and Duquesnel signals that very obviously in his writing, most notably by the fact that every single episode, they're all quite short episodes, as you remember, is followed by 3 dots. And the episodes are joined and separated by the 3 dots at the foot. There they are. Called in French point de suspension. I don't know what we call them in English apart from 3 dots. They must have an official name. Helixes, yes. That's what they are. Thanks, Linda. Which is taking out. But also quite a number of Duquesnel's final sentences end without a quotation mark. For example, the one that I just opened up here, page 48, the last sentence, it's a longer last sentence. J'échafaud du plan dérisoire. He's talking about dreaming his friend is near death, coming back to the hospital and pulling the plug. So j'échafaud du plan dérisoire pour revenir au milieu de la nuit, entrer dans l'hôpital, me glisser dans le service, puis dans la chambre, le débrancher en douce, virgule, okay, unplug him surreptitiously, comma, attendre. Right. Attendre is a kind of verb that is either intransitive or transitive according to the context. We don't know what follows from that. That could be the end of the sentence or it could not be. So that practice, then on top of the point de suspension and the ellipses, Finally, there are two practices that are represented by the one example there. One practice is just not punctuating the end of the sentence, which is already a mark that it's not the end, even though it reads grammatically like the end. The third practice is leaving a sentence suspended so that it requires completion by the reader, also illustrated by the same example, but there are other examples. And I just draw your attention to his own diagnosis of what he calls in extremis writing, okay, which is on page 110. I won't translate it because it's so wonderfully disabused. I suppose cynical in the ancient sense of the word cynical, dog-like. It's whatever the rhetorical word, the rhetorical name for the figure of telling the truth is. Here he is coming up from the uncovered, telling the truth. In extremis, n'écrivons pas tous le même livre. Don't we all write the same? Le même misérable livre. Littéraire pour ne pas faire morbide, impudique pour faire sincère, elliptique pour ne pas avoir l'air de se plaindre, féroce pour se persuader qu'on existe, livre d'anecdotes cruelles, lapsus de médecin, lâcheté, lâchage, fuite, parisianisme, ruse tordue pour se dédouaner, masochisme divers, aveu, pause, soupir. 3 points de suspension. Le lecteur, sans doute, n'a pas mérité d'avaler ce on to say, il faut bien que ça sorte sur le papier, puisque les autres ont peur de cette parole noire. It's got to be written down because you can't say it to people. They're afraid of this parole noire. Mais, n'est pas Proust. But we're not talking about Proust here. That's a really important passage which somebody might like to write a dissertation on Monday. End of introduction. Almost time for the break. We're doing great. Okay, so let's look at the poems. I chose these two poems because between them they enact one version, at least, of this dynamic of suspension, and each of them is a poem of suspension in its own right. You can quibble about whether the Doge's poem is actually aftermath writing or not. I don't care about that myself. But the Monet poem certainly is aftermath writing. And what they do between them is relate the suspension of the dying of the other, which is what the Doge poem is largely about, to the performance of that suspension by one, a writer or a subject, who is his or herself in the limbo of survival, also suspended, in other words. And that's what the Monet poem is largely all about. Let's quickly look at the Monet poem first. Marginal, called current status, which is already a significant title, 122.87. Marginal, no change, T4 465 as of 12.8. But the labs are notorious for his nerdy white coat, sits eyeballing his microscope, counts the squiggles in a cubic inch, racks them up on his abacus and writes his apartment number on the lab slip. Thus, I'm 15, less than August, 35 more than June. This is not statistically meaningful, nor am I. The walking wounded do not count. The counting begins to break through. How are my lymph nodes? How are they not? A mere 3/4 centimetre at the neck in the vampire spot, 1.5 centimetres in the armpit, not suggested, unless they harden or start to throb, taking 400 milligrams of ribavirin, BID. The magic dose, if results released 1/9, proved to be long-term. Of course, when you cry all day, an afternoon can be frightfully long-term. But we mustn't muss the curve with personal agenda, etc., etc. I won't read it all. That'll give you a picture of the first part of the poem, in which the subject of the writing is describing a a limbo situation in which he is suspended between health and dying, between health and illness, health and onset, the breakthrough. So in that situation that is already agonic, of waiting, situation of anticipation. And towards the bottom of that page, he introduces the figure of the equator, or the image of the equator, which will come back at the end of the poem, so that you get the sense that being in that limbo is being in a position about 5 feet north of the equator, waiting to cross the equator, and in a position 5 feet south of the equator. David E., who just got back from the Rift Valley, where man began, says if you flush a toilet 5 feet south of the equator, the spiral flows clockwise. 5 feet north flows counterclockwise. This is the only non-medical thing I have learned to bring out for the so there's your image for the suspension, I might say. Speaking autobiographically here, when I was young, I remember being in a Peninsula or an Orient liner on my first trip out of Australia in the direction of the Northern Hemisphere, trying, occupying the men's toilet for a very long time, trying to, doing an experiment in toilet flushing, while people battered on the door and said, "Let me in." I never got it right. Very hard to calculate when you're 5 feet from the equator. But the other thing is, of course, that the sentences are suspended because they're in jam, because of the metrical practice of in jam. Nearly every line, not every line, I haven't counted them, but the vast majority of lines in the poem are in jams, so you get that discrepancy, important discrepancy, between the, in fact, rather regular and almost monotonous line rhythm and the broken syntax of the sentences, which are both continuous and discontinuous. But the other side of suspension is the story of a repetition, a continuation with respect to a story that has already occurred, been interrupted by a death, and that becomes clear when he turns apostrophically to address Rog. On page 36, right at the top. Rog, I'm still in the anteroom of all the useless measures, leaping old peoples. He's remembering sitting in the hospital waiting room while Rog was going through Rogers. Leaping old peoples, reading diplomas. Deep in my head I hear you the night of the third intrusion, your larynx like slush from an extra milliliter stream of xylocaine, quelling your voice to a strangled tooth. Why? I don't know, I said, all the bells in my voice untarnished, and thought how no one had better try to say why, either, or ever supposed to know the worst. Take my pills like clockwork because you took yours. Submit to the week's bleeding because you fought like Theseus for the white crown, etc., etc. So the repetition, but you can already see you fought like Theseus for the hill. The repetition traversed by a sense of doubt whether the next person in line, which is me, Paul, is going to be up to the mark, is going to measure up in the way that Rod measured up to the ordeal, which of course picks up on a major thematic in both time. And so the poem ends with a sense of course, with a sense of relay, but with a sense that the person who is receiving the relay is not yet in training, not yet ready to do it. There's a whole process that has to be gone through, and he's just at the beginning of it, but you see where it starts here. That's a very interesting phenomenon. There's no way you can start in this poem once you've stopped. Okay, no space. This set of printouts, clinically healthy. Clinically healthy. Why does that sound like a qualification? Okay, now, everybody found the place. It's about 10 lines from the bottom. Is this how being a hero starts? Or just dying? Equal and elderly. There's another repetition involved there, right? Men have lain down in certain fields with all their unspent years. But meanwhile, there is the fight. Before that, the target practice. I'm learning how to hold a sword. But there's no telling what I'll do when I get there. Stay at my side, will you, so I don't do anything vain or cease to honour you and all our brothers devoted. But ends with that appeal to a bond to stay at my side. But it's not clear that the bond is a substantial one. It might be a great bond. They're all good. The elegies for that. And so is rope, which comes from Atlantis, fairly recent collection of Mark Doty's, possibly his most recent, I think. No, I think I'll just plunge in. Our street, it's about Providence, Provincetown, Massachusetts, sorry. Which, as you know, probably is a little town right out on the end of the peninsula, surrounded by water on three sides, always misty, foggy, one of those places where the land and the sea are hard to separate from each other, a liminal place. Our street unspools toward the harbour, where Mark Doty retreated with his lover Wally while Wally was dying. A story which is told in Heaven's Coast, which appeared by further last time. Our street unspools toward the harbour, swerving past guest houses, the ancient jumble of roses, fence pickets, and a formal tumble crowded as a Persian miniature, a crazy court, every corner filled. Where there might be a vacant spot, there's a boat and dry dock, Clorox, unfortunate Monica, and an intricate strip of garden where someone's knotted a tapestry of kale and sweet pea beside a roped pyramid of lobster traps. It's the first place I've ever really wanted to live. Out North Maybury Road is turning the corner. You don't know what's around the bend. Encampment, across the strophe. Our curve surprises with harbour cliff. A bobbing dinghy. Our curve surprises with harbour glitter, bobbing dinghy and sunstruck triangle boats, two trawlers hardly going out whatever their business is. Dot. Stop the dot. So suspension here in this first part of the poem is being stuck at the corner. You don't know what's around the bend. You're nearly there, but you're not there. And what's around the bend is figured by the harbour, where the business of the boats, you know the business of the boats is going on, but you don't know what their business is. You're still in the street, unspooling towards it. Okay, here, just where the street bends, is my favourite house. Shingled, narrow and elaborate Edwardian toaster of a house covered with moss and drifting almost perceptibly towards colours. Anthony lives there, and Charlie. They walk early or late to escape the heat. Charlie, the antique spaniel, lives surprised, of course, on his rope leash. So much time elapsed between steps you might take him for porcelain, an incredibly decrepit statue, or a particularly far-gone carpet bag of buffalo hide, something allowed to moulder in a heap in the barn until mice made of it their own version of the granaries of Babylon. He is that old. I don't know if Anthony would move faster on his own. I've never seen him without Charlie, but his pace precisely matches themselves, as if together they were one full submarine, adapted to the pressure of great depths. I've seen them down on the shore in the evening, leaning against the shoulder of an upturned dory. We're soaking up some moonshine, Anthony calls. The truth is, I avoid them, since Anthony delivers monologues which do not have endings. lucid, interesting even, but listening to commitment of uncertainty. Great, considerable length. I don't see them for days, and then I worry, since you can almost smell the fragility of their age. And when Charlie cries a little from the difficulty of picking himself up on those no longer reliable legs, Anthony can't hear him. I'm a little surprised every time they reappear, and glad. They stand for hope and seem as tentative and constant as the steeple of the Unitarian Church, which leans a little to the right. But lately Charlie is not walking well. A few steps and those legs buckle beneath him. So Anthony has constructed a sort of rope harness which the good soldier of ongoingness wears. And when he falls and looks up from those drooped, ancient eyes which have seen the rise of empires, from which the face has sagged away, relinquishing its form to the steady pull of earth, Anthony can lift him up, even hold him suspended for a while, so that Charlie can move his own legs and feet. We're a great team, I must say. That's flattering myself. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So I said, the poem defines art as being stuck in the corner. And that's what art is. So now we have a corner on which Anthony and Charlie live, which they're stuck. They're suspended at the bend of their life, just Anthony with his monologues that have no use. And Charlie, suspended in his rope harness, held up by Anthony. There's the central figure that I wanted to draw your attention to. Obviously, you don't get suspension without someone without a suspendee and a suspender. A nice pair of red ones there at literature. So that Charlie can have the illusion of going for a walk, even when he's already beyond going for a walk, thanks to being held up, right? Held up by related to Erheben, who speaks French, don't speak German, his philosophical undertone is quite concrete verse. Of this situation, what do the neighbours say? They say when the dog goes. So the neighbours are making up suspension of their own. They're suspending the dog in the same way that Anthony. So art is an art of turning the corner. Turning the corner can't be an art of death. It can only be an art of turning the corner in the direction of whatever lies beyond the corner. Okay? And it consists then of suspending the other in his dying. But the suspension of the object presupposes the subject who is himself suspended because also poised at the brink of death. You really can't tell quite the difference between Anthony, the survivor, and Charlie, the surviving good soldier of ongoingness. Okay, last two stanzas. But who suggests Charlie's lived long enough? Think of Solomon, who commanded the child be divided between mothers. Who could cut apart one living thing? Or sever the rope that holds them both in the world? It's frayed as it is. Art is this strong, exactly. Love's gravity. The weight of Charlie's body into those harnesses, suspended. So despite the difference between the two, between the suspendee and the suspender, the poem says they can't be separated. And the reason the poem seems able to say that is that the rope that joins them is part of a whole world of weaving that the poem has been building from, about the unspooling history. The intricate strip of garden, knotted like a tapestry, the Persian miniature, quite crazy quilt, the roped pyramid of multi-tracks, etc. You can run through those for yourself and see that the poem is describing the world as being knit together, tied together, like, in the form of a syndic. It's a poem about syndic, not about which uses a syndic as one of its figures, but it affirms syndic. That's to say, a binding, a tying, a joining. It understands itself to be performing a syndic, even while it anticipates the asyndeton that it doesn't want to say and can't say. But it foreshadows the rope's frayed. So it's countering an asyndeton with a syndeton, even while knowing that it doesn't even necessarily succeed in it. Let me just make a quick finding of my own, which began in the direction of Lastec, and then we'll stop and have a break. What I would want to say is that there is a major difference between Lastec and a poem like this one, which is, of course, that now Charlie is dead. In Lastec, Charlie is called Jean-François, and Jean-François has died, leaving Antony with Bertrand, looking men, alone. But you can nevertheless say that, despite that difference, Bertrand's narrative in Lastec is like a harness in which Jean-François is kept unusually alive, if only because Bertrand is repeating the story in his own life, the story of Jean-François' death in his own life. So Bertrand is in Antony's position with respect to Jean-François, in the way that Paul Manette is in Antony's position with respect to Rog, which is the position of being himself suspended in the limbo of survival, the sempiternel sursis, the everlasting deferment. Since Bertrand himself can only recount his own dying, he can't recount his own death, the binding that will follow from his own death is not something he can perform. It's going to be up to his reader to perform that binding. So we have the relay structure, Jean-François, Bertrand, and that last story. That's significant. That difference between the two texts is very significant, because Mark Doty's relative optimism, which is they stand for hope, as tentative and constant as the steeple of the Unitarian Church, which is leading but hasn't fallen over. Mark Doty's optimism is dependent on maintaining a syndeton, whereas in Lastec, the death has occurred, and so the writing can only ever be an asyndeton, can only ever be an attempt to deal with a break that has occurred, to reweave a connection that has, following a severance that has already occurred, and that's a much more difficult and dubious task than the one that Mark Doty prescribes. So, anybody want to make a comment or something? Stop. Intervene.
All these texts are elegiac.
Absolutely. And absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Now that we have these kinds of texts to contributing to the elegiac genre, yes, I think so. I'm not good on the English poetic tradition. Do you know a romantic elegy, for example, that uses that same kind of metaphorics of suspension? One should go back, I suppose, and look at the classical ones.
something like that in there.
I'm sure you would if you started looking. I mean, we're good, right? We can. Once we know what we're looking for, we're pretty certain we'll find it. Yeah. But yeah, I think there's been a revival of the Romantic Elegy. Perhaps an over-professionalised way of saying it, but that's one of the things that's going on. Yeah.
Modern elegy, where it talks about differences between modern and the Romantic elegy. In fact, it talks about how the modern elegy wants to milk all that elegiac tradition, but won't accept the transcendence of consolation.
Okay.
So that might be the more
That's
relevant.
That's very good. That's perfect. Yeah. That would do it. What's his first name? Did you figure out I gave you the wrong title for the show Miller Frank's book? Oh, good. Well, I didn't give you the wrong title, but I have all the info here if you want to follow it up. Any other thoughts or problems? Objections? Sorry we had to read those poems so fast, but if you can stand it, you might want to spend it. I think we can do with a break. I mean, this is. I don't think we should do that. Brought them all in and everything. I think pretty much everything that I have. I mean, it takes about 2 pages of notes here, but pretty much everything that I have to say is already in place, so I can be fast. I'm an old trooper. I can be fast or slow, depending on how much time there is to fill in. So let's take a break and then look at the picture.
Are we on your way? Here? Yes.
I should tell you about Miss General Idea Boutique. General Idea, first I'll give you general idea. Our group of Canadian, sit down for a second, see my own notes. Canadian artists who joined together as a collective in the 70s, I guess, for the first time, and their names were Horta Serra, Ron Gabe, and Michael Timms. They also all had pseudonyms. Jorge Brontau, Felix Parts, and A.A. Bronson. So you may hear any of those names. They created this thing called Miss General Idea 1984. They did this in the 70s. They wanted 1984 with all of the apocalyptic stuff going on in it, of course, quite naturally. But they also used it as a framework for a whole series of things. There was a Miss General Idea boutique. There was a Miss General Idea pavilion. There was for a number of sort of collective shows over the years. And this was from their boutique. But I'm just going to back up here. They had they had fashion shows. This is the blind leading the blind, as they called it. It was a whole series of things that basically took on Western capitalism, which was their main target. Capitalist imbrication with art, and the capitalist sort of view. So they set up a magazine. Well, this is backwards. Hold on, I knew if I put these in quickly, I'd do that. They did a wonderful magazine for about 10 years called File, which was a parody of Life magazine, and it was done in the same format. They began presenting themselves as poodles at about this point, and they did a series, which I'll show you in a minute, called Mondo Kane Kama Sutra. 12 different positions in a dog-eat-dog world where art is going to the dogs, and where the artist is the spoiled pet, hence the poodle of capitalist society. They're absolutely outrageous. They're very funny, and they have always been extremely funny in their parodic presentations. This is part of the Mondo Kane Kama Sutra. Also overtly gay throughout the whole thing, right from the very beginning. This has been part of the self-presentation. This is a fresco from the, I've got to get the title of this absolutely right. It's the Three Graces mural fragment, fresco from the, and I've got to see if I can read my own scribbles here because there's no light over here. Okay, thank you. From the Room of the Unknown Function in the Villa dei Misteri of the 1984 Miss General Idea Pavilion, just so you get an idea of the kind of thing they do. So this is the kind of background, and they work together and they do this kind of large collective work for about 10 years. And then 2 of the 3 test HIV positive. And they continue doing this sort of work, but they also begin to do things like this AIDS poster, which you might have seen. It was all around the United States and everywhere else. They start doing AIDS work, AIDS activist work. And they had a show in Toronto just before 2 of them, in fact, died. 2 have died now. This was down at the power plant in Toronto, and it was basically a year's supply of AZT. Okay, was the show. And it was in various forms and various, there were 2 parts of the show. This was one. The walls were covered with this. The floors were covered with it. Okay. Then there was this. You walked into a room, and there were these big styrofoam blocks which were meant to be ice. And on the ice were not 3 poodles, but 3 baby seals. Which in a Canadian context is an interesting way to figure victimization. But what accompanied it was an absolutely hilarious sign about how they really wanted to get to a Canadian audience and figured the only way you could get to a Canadian audience was to use the seal. I mean, they did it so self-reflexively that it was really, I mean, you found yourself laughing despite yourself. And so they had a couple of these. And they had only one show, but it took up a whole room. It's very hard to get a good picture of it, but that was the idea. We can put the lights on for a second, I'll show you. Then as you moved out of this part, you walked into one in which you could, for $10, buy a piece of general idea art, which was a soap seal, it's all passed around, and General Idea's putti. This was their putti, which says, a seal-shaped soap on printed pulpboard, edition of 10,000, General Idea 1993, $10 to go to AIDS research. So this was their self-witnessing, protest, ironized sort of, in much the same spirit as the earliest. It was very interesting. And it left audiences a little not quite knowing what to do.
A little edgy.
Yeah, it was very edgy, actually. The seal part in particular.
Yeah. I don't want to touch it.
Thank you. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about it.
Sort of an interesting idea of being so clean yourself.
Yeah.
Through
Absolutely.
representation.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we clean
That's
ourselves
good.
with the
That's
baby
good.
seals. And
Yeah.
I guess in a certain sense, it sort of came up in zero tolerance. As well as a scapegoat, and you've got this other way of sort of cleansing yourself through representing victims of guilt, but not really resolving.
Interesting that you said zero tolerance, because I hadn't realized when we were talking about zero patience that zero tolerance is a...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Zero tolerance is what it says on the road, right?
Yeah. It comes from academic criminology.
Oh, there you go.
We talk a lot about that. Victims and cleansing.
No, but it brings back another...
Well, I think there probably is a relation to that.
That non-Canadians are sensitive to it, so don't you think? North America-wide too.
Yeah, in connection with drugs, particularly zero
Oh.
tolerance for drug taking.
That,
Also,
because that makes it even more...
zero tolerance for sexual harassment,
Yeah.
one of the other things.
No, it's not up to date. When I stop teaching, it will be as if I don't live in the same world as anyone else. Thank God for 19-year-olds. at least keep you in touch with what's going on. But thank you. That was extraordinary
Interesting
stuff.
stuff that
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember exactly what you said last week that made me do sort of...
It was something about zero patience. Yeah.
The same spirit of ironic
Mm.
humor.
that
Yeah.
1993, you said that exhibit was? That's very much the same period as those films.
Sort of, it connects up nicely with that business about burning in Paris, burning in Paris, the one about the voguing.
Yeah.
They're trying to recreate selfhood. They flip that quite nicely so that you don't have that sort of heart-rending image of blacking and trying to put on muffler and stage around. But
Where did you get takes?
no, I'm just saying it's so nice and cheery. I found that
Oh,
that
okay,
show
I see.
so
Yeah, nice and cheery.
disturbing.
Oh,
This is kind of a
yeah.
It allows you to laugh, which allows you maybe to deal with
Which
it.
they've always insisted you do. I mean, even in the most serious anti-capitalist stuff, they've always made you sort of critique your humor.
Yes.
I really like this stuff.
Yeah.
There's a retrospective on art gallery.
I
You can still buy, they have a series of cool crests on cloth. So you can still buy real general idea art at the art gallery.
Is the art gallery that's whatever it is? Yeah, done it. Yeah.
Very effective. They're very good.
I'm going to have to move to Toronto. I think.
Great.
This is ridiculous trying to do things one day a week. Not enough. I've never cloned myself. Should we do a segue and will you try and say something more or less consecutive, if not consistent, about Vice Tech, and then we can vote at the end about whether to devote some time next week to cosmic time or not. I wanted to make that contrast between the Dodi poem and Vice Tech, so as to draw your attention to the way in which Dodi's insistence is on binding and Wittgenstein's insistence is on the break, particularly the major break halfway through, which is very interestingly constructed because you have the actual break signaled on page 50. Le téléphone sonne, c'est fini. There it is, the interruption of the telephone ringing. But already on page 49, Bertrand has gotten up in the morning and noticed skin allergy, I think, from memory, symptom of some kind, and said, okay, this is mon tour. He said, my turn now. And that very slight discrepancy whereby the relay happens, it's like when you make a mistake in a relay race and you grab it too soon, right? A very slight discrepancy signals the breakness of the break somehow or other, even more than treating it in serial chronological order would have done. So there's kind of an emphasis, more of an emphasis on the disconnection here than there is on the connection. Well, that corresponds to your own intuition about having read it. But certainly it's my general feeling about it. And consequently, because of that sense of disconnection, there's more of an emphasis too on the sense in which, as aftermath writing, this narrative is a failure and a fraud. The abus de confiance that Sakati talks about. So I'll run through some of the ways in which that disconnection is figured. Although you need to remember that there's another side to the question. That it's still true that the symmetry between one suspended sentence and another suspended sentence is maintained throughout the book. I'm going to insist on the ways in which the disconnection is right. First of all, the play of the pronouns. Jean-François's story is told in the third person singular, il, whereas Bertrand's story, as survivor, is told in the first person singular, je. Consequently, there's an external perspective on the story of Jean-François and an internal perspective. And maybe this isn't standard terminology today that we'll do for our purposes. But I can never remember Jeanette's terms, so take half an hour off and look them up all over again. Difference of perspective on the two stories, which is just signalled grammatically all the way through. Other texts, like Michel Magniere's Ce qui m'ont aimé, or the recent book that I mentioned to you, La vie des morts et des puissants, use second person singular apostrophe as their way of budging that distinction. And that's, I guess there's no time to go into it now, but it's an interesting rhetorical move because in a way it reproduces what it was trying to budge. So there's that stylistic level. The real problem arises, though, from the fact that the distance between the two was already there, so to speak, from the start, precedes the actual death of Jean-François. The two had been lovers. Jean-François, becoming seropositive, left Bertrand, and came back to him when he was already ill. Came back to Bertrand when he was already ill, because he, of course, needed support. So the description of his illness is framed by this idea that il est déjà mort. The evidence for that is that everybody is treating him pour tout le monde. Il est mort. And so, even again, before he dies, Bertrand's feeling is je me laisse mourir avec lui et je le hais. It's the line. So that the difference is an early difference. It's not the break, the split, if you like, occurs before the death and is, so to speak, sanctioned by the death rather than being caused by the death. And so again, during that first story, the story of Jean-François' death, something that Bertrand calls the cache-cache, the jeu de cache-cache, the hide-and-seek game, has already begun. I'm sure you remember the moment when the two of them are in Compiègne, sitting in separate rooms, listening to each other but not able to talk. J'écoute, il m'écoute. Nos pensées se croisent sans se trouver, rebondissant sur le plafond, les tissus fanés, les mailles du lavabo. Lui, moi, lui, cache-cache, improbable, silencieux. He listens to me. Our thoughts cross without reaching each other and bounce on the ceiling, the faded tissue cloth, the enamel in the shiny stuff in the bathroom. He, hide and go seek, an improbable, silent hide and go seek game. And later on, a few pages later, une déception réciproque nous submerge. Can't read my own writing here. Plus forte que nous, je le déçois de n'avoir pas trouvé quelque chose d'impossible, un lien sublime et secret qui illuminerait sa peur. get the word that I couldn't read. Page 39. Amer. So a reciprocal disappointment submerges us, bitter, stronger than us, stronger than we are. I disappoint him for not having found something impossible, a link, a binding, sublime and secret binding, which would, it is like I looked this up because I made a mistake, which would illuminate his end, qui illuminerait sa fin. Il me déçoit, he deceives me, he disappoints me, de se laisser mourir ainsi, for allowing himself to die in this way, tétanisé par sa peur panique, made paralyzed by his panic fear. So there's the impossible thing that's being asked, right? This is demand in the Lacanian sense. Demand is for there to be a bond that would be real, but it's impossible. So I think, we've talked a little bit about this with Pat during our break. I think there's a law that needs to be verified more, so don't quote me on this yet, but I think there's a law of dual autobiography, which is that there is always a break that precedes the break. The break of death is always preceded by a prior break, and that the guilt associated with inheriting the responsibility of writing the dead derives from the prior break, not from the break of death. That's why I think the quotation from Passage to India that you get at the beginning of the first page is about these caves, right? You strike a light and you see a reflection of the light, and two reflections get close to each other but they can't be joined. Les deux flammes, this is the French version, I didn't look it up of course. Les deux flammes s'approchent pour s'unir, mais n'y parviennent pas, car l'une respire l'air, de l'air et l'autre de la pierre. It's a fatality. There's always this break. And I'll just mention, because we haven't had anything to do with Italian literature, it's Cavalletti, Dante, a novel by Vittorio Tondelli, T-I-N-D-E-L-L-I. It's been translated, it's called Separate Rooms, Camere Separate, which is also, I think, all about the failure of jointness as a given. It's great, it's a very interesting and excellent piece of writing. And the only one of Tondelli's novels that I can read in the original Italian, because the rest of them are written partly, the conversations take place in Bolognese dialect, and difficult things like that. Okay, so there is the break is given here, precedes the death. And next point, it's associated very clearly with the split between writing and reading. If you like, it's crystallized. The kashkash is the kashkash of writing and reading when death is the subject of both. Death is the subject of writing, and death is the subject of reading. There is automatically an interruption, a split that is realized by the relation of writing to reading. And you remember there's the episode before Jean-François' death, but when it turns out that Jean-François is himself a writer and writing his last text, which we're not given any examples of, but Jean-François reads it, mentions its ellipses and its absences of punctuation. It's on page 37 if you want to check. But he reads it very critically. He reads it as being solipsistic, as being a retreat into death. Jean-François' retreat from life and his abandonment of his friends. Les faits de ton livre, listen to the text that he writes for Jean-François. L'effet de ton livre est de clore ta vie comme une trajectoire inexorable et logique vers la maladie. Ce n'est que l'instrument de ton autodestruction. He reads it as being unreadable because already closed, self-enclosed, right? One of those Parisian texts, so famous for being publishable but unreadable. And he says so, right? He says so to Jean-François. Whence, and then realizes it was une erreur fatale. Right? That was the error. This time, not being able to read the text because his only way of reading it was to read it as being self-enclosed. So that his criticism brings about the effect that he was trying to diagnose. Il est soudain si loin de moi, inaccessible. So, page 38. So the implication would seem to be that when you're writing about, when a subject is writing about the subject's dying and death, the only reading possible of that writing is a misreading, a fatal misreading. It's a death-dealing misreading. Say, in literary theory terms, the death of the author is the condition of reading. Okay? Therefore, reading is never loyal. Reading is never an accurate reading. Although we don't know what accurate reading will be. We have no way of knowing what an accurate reading will be, or recognizing if we actually accidentally produced one. So what's intended by the writing subject as the ultimate act of communication can only be read as a gesture of departure and rupture, break. Consequently, if you read aftermath writing as bringing into connection the story of the dying and the story of the writing, we also have to understand those two stories as being now the story of the writing and the story of the reading. And we have to understand that the break that connects the story of the dying and the story of the writing is also the break that connects the writing and the reading, which is the reason for Bertrand's skepticism about the power of his writing in the second half of the book. He's already experienced the failure of writing in the first half. Okay, next point. After the death, however, AZT. Did you say AZT in Kenneth or AZT? Why don't you say AZT? Oh, yeah.
Doesn't usually work, but in this
Yeah. Yeah.
probably because we sound like, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's actually aesthetic.
Of course it would be, yeah. Anyway, whatever the stuff is, I'm not going to try and pronounce its pharmaceutical name. After the death, which of course, which Jean-François is basically solitary, is back with his family, which is, these kinds of writings always regarded as being an exile and a form of solitary. It's the introduction of AZT as a therapy that figures the split, that represents the difference, the radical difference between Bertrand, the survivor, and Jean-François, who is dead. And that's because it marks a double difference for Jean-François. On the one hand, for Bertrand. On the one hand, Bertrand is getting AZT. It's just been invented, so to speak. Jean-François did not get AZT. Bertrand is getting it. It's 1987. You're old enough to remember that in 1987 there was a lot of optimism about AZT. I remember a long discussion with a doctor that I had in 1987 thereabouts, which said it's time to go out and get the test, because now we can do something. So there was an optimism around about that. It looked as if it would prolong life, perhaps indefinitely. So it's the figure for the possible long-term survival of Jean-François as opposed to, of Bertrand as opposed to Jean-François' early days. So it reproduces the dying, surviving speaking. The difference is therefore greater between the two. I'll skip some stuff about. Well, no. Just let me say that that the difference between the perspectives, between the internal perspective and the external perspective, now is manifested in a narrative kind of way, because in that passage where Bertrand works with the grammatical difference between the conditional tense in French and the future tense in French, moving from the question au nom de quoi lui survivrai-je, conditional tense, by virtue of on behalf of in favour of what, for what reason would I survive him, to the future tense au nom de quoi lui survivrai-je, right? By what reason will I survive him? Now, of course, make the same distinction in the third person, but we're reading it in the first person, and so it hits you as being the kind of subtlety of perception that only an internal perspective gives you any insight into. The only way you can do that with the third person narrative is to use the window onto consciousness kind of technique that introduces into somebody else's mind. But this text doesn't do that. We do not ever introduce any examples. So surviving is equated with that internal perspective. At the same time, though, as that difference occurs in Bertrand, the au nom de quoi question still remains, right? It's only the difference between the tenses of the verbs. The doubt about whether it's worth surviving or not remains, or whether there's any point in surviving or not remains. So, in that sense, there's kind of continuity. In another sense, there's continuity. It is continuity. Upset. Because Bertrand's main sense is still the sense of being suspended, still being one of the clients of Dr. Rosenbaum, who's a real, very famous French doctor. Remember the bit where he's sitting in the waiting room looking at the other clients and wishing he wasn't one of them, and he describes them as being en suspens, page 61, and describes himself as being condamné à tenter de vivre pour arriver à mourir, condemned to try to live so as to succeed in dying. Survival is both the same as and different than, in particular in this text, more different than the same as the dying predecessor. Difference between those two. But the other difference that I mentioned, it seems like half an hour ago now, because I got involved in a whole lot of little details, but the other difference is the difference that taking AZT makes between the Aztecs and non-Aztecs. Right? Now, not the non-Aztecs who died before AZT was invented in this case, but the non-Aztecs who were other survivors. As an Aztec, Bertrand is still on the side of death. He's still on the side of, still close to Jean-François in that sense, in relation to the non-Aztecs, whose attitude he describes in the long passage at the end. It's kind of a parody of an anthropology of Aztecs, right, which begins by saying, l'Aztèque complique la vie des non-Aztèques. Right? The Aztec is a complication in the life of non-Aztecs, And then he goes on for about almost a page to describe the different kinds of responses that Aztecs get from non-Aztecs. The whole long list of different kinds of non-Aztec, those who send postcards, those who just stop communicating, etc., etc. Right? So the double sense of difference with respect to Jean-François, difference with respect to those who are regarded here as being not affected. Ceux qui connaissent un Aztèque, ceux des non-Aztèques qui connaissent un Aztèque ont tendance à fuir, says quite clearly. And so finally then, because of those two differences, the general judgment is me voici seul le monde, seul contre le monde entier. Or at least not exactly alone, but a member of the tribe of the solitary, the tribe of the Aztecs. Right? Therefore, kind of in a liminary position, neither completely with the dead, but not with the living either, right? Somewhere in between, and more on the side of the dead than on the side of the living. So there's another reason now why writing is futile. Who's going to understand it? Who are you writing for, and who's going to understand your writing? It's the only thing you can do, apparently. Kind of a law again. The only thing that you can do in your surrounding state is write, because that's the responsibility that you inherited from Jean-François, and presumably from your own era with respect to Jean-François writing. You have to fix that up somehow. But it's impossible. It doesn't restore the lost connection with Jean-François, nor can it reach the non-Aztecs, because it is inevitably boring, repetitive, and a whole tissue of rhetorical falsifications of the kind that I read to you before. And so it becomes a way of what he calls crystallizing his woes. Right? Je n'ai pas trouvé des oubliés.
Religious or philosophical context in which Shakespeare was putting that into the mouth of Rosalind. I think there is a kind of vulgarized Kantianism which we can slip into, by which we think that if we speak of something under a certain description, that in some sense the actual description is constitutive of how the thing is. I was very struck by that wonderful Pietà of Marat, and the dying of the dead Marat. And I wonder now, supposing some archaeologists had discovered this and had wrongly assigned it to the other party and had said this is clearly a description of the dying Louis XVI. Now, it seems to me there are certain types of historicism which want to say that this would constitute this a description of the dying Louis XVI, that simply by understanding it in that way you would have somehow altered its nature. Now it seems to me that forever that is a Pietà of Marat, whatever anybody may think at any time. And in this sense, I think I want to say there are statements not expressed in some absolute and timeless language, but statements that are true or false. Wittgenstein has done more, I suppose, than anyone else to stress the fact that we belong to a linguistic community and that all our agreements and disagreements must be related to the kind of linguistic community that we belong to, but he also stressed the necessity for community of judgment. Without community of judgment, language doesn't, as it were, get going at all. There has to be some kind of purchase on reality for language to be. And all types of skeptical arguments, or to speak in the Kantian mode, transcendental arguments, which either establish strange transcendental activities and objects, the imagination, as in Coleridge. These somehow have to be related for them to have any purchase on us to that which can be stated and to which we can attach certain terms of appraisal, not only true or false, but fitting, unfitting, wise, foolish, and the like. And I think I want to say that no matter what the historical scheme within which we make our particular judgments, there are certain elements in our judgments that transcend any particular historical formulation. I don't think that the usual refutations of E.G. Marx, this may please Professor White, I don't think that when they say, well, after all, by your own theory, you yourself are a mere ideologist. This has always seemed to me to be an objection that Marx was very well aware of, and in one of the famous theses on Feuerbach about the failure of old-style materialism, he showed not only that he was aware of this, but that there was a possible way round it. Now, whether in fact his way round it is satisfactory is another question, I think. But I think with that I will give way to the next speaker.
Next name I have is Professor Louis Mink. If you can extricate yourself somehow.
Actually, it's 15 minutes before, and I think there are some other people who may have things to say. Actually, what I wanted to say is only a comment in one sentence and a question, which is in a sentence with 6 semicolons in it, so may I say both from here. The comment is simply to note for the record that there hasn't, nobody's mentioned North American Romanticism, much less North American historicism. And on behalf of all the representatives of American studies, and some who are, I'd simply record the fact that while I'm not terribly displeased that we didn't hear as much about Emerson as we did about Wordsworth, Emerson was there. The question is this, and I pass up the chance to continue Professor Cameron's remarks, except to say that I am in fact a vulgarized Kantian, and I recommend it to anyone who's interested in the theory of history. Phyllis Miller convinced me that the form of the novel of the 19th century presupposed or drew upon an implicit reference to historical representation. The form of the novel, oversimplified, comes from the form of narrative history, semicolon. Before that, I was convinced by others, including Hayden Wine, that the form of narrative history in the 19th century was a representation of the form of sensibility expressed in the novel. So my question at the moment is, did the form of sensibility represented by novelists give rise to the forms of narrative history, or did the forms of narrative history give somehow affect the sensibility of novelists? I don't think I would be satisfied with some kind of zeitgeist answer to this, that there was a sensibility representing itself in all of these different ways. Maybe the only possible answer to this is merely to tell the story of how the succession of forms came about, which would seem, as a word of prejudice, the question that favors a certain kind of answer.
The last name on my long list is that of Professor Jeffrey Hartman, Yale.
I also feel that there are others who should be speaking, so I'd like just to add 2 minutes. First, I feel somewhat playful. I guess I feel we've come to the satire part. But before I indulge in this, I do want to thank the author of all this, namely Cy Hamlin, not only for begetting the conference, but for being its preacher or evangelist and reminding us just in time that all is not vanity. In my own reflections on myself too, because the conference has taught me things, I feel at the moment that I am going to go away thinking in a dichotomy, and I don't like to think in dichotomies. It's not perhaps a dichotomy forceful enough to disturb me too long. It's too typological, namely a division of the questions we've been dealing with into what is the mode of historical discourse. This is a question which might be answered in terms of a reflection on genre. I think Hernadi would like us to go that way. In terms of reflection of, well, I don't know what it is, of language, of topology, like Hayden White is suggesting. And I want to say something about this type of reflection on the mode of historical discourse. And the second type of question I'm going to be thinking about is not on the mode of historical discourse, and I understand that discourse is an ambiguous term, but on the status of historical discourse, which to me at this point has to do with value, that is, with use and abuse. Now, I don't make large claims for this dichotomy. It may prove to be totally false, but enables me to say something at this point, a kind of summary to myself. I've already mentioned that Hernadi felt very strongly that we can't avoid the genre question. I think this is true of Hayden White also. History is a tale told by whom? Isn't it a drama? Well, in a sense, you have to follow out a metaphor here, whether you like it or not. And however the quality of your consciousness of the metaphor. If you say history is a tale told by whom, one answer would be a tale told by an idiot, yet signifying. The other answer is a tale told by God, yet not signifying. This is, of course, to make a literary use of all this, but I am not sure we can entirely avoid that. That is, the very reflection on the mode of historical discourse, if it turns into a question of what genre, what language, is carried on often in metaphorical terms which have to break themselves and reconstitute themselves. And I think there were some others who felt that this was the case. And perhaps what Hillis Miller said about the raveling and unraveling, which we usually attribute only to novels, and some of us don't even to novels, that kind of submerged self-consciousness, I think clearly this is a very important contribution which White has made to the examination of the mode of historical discourse, and perhaps is always there in philosophers, insofar as they look at anything except their own discipline. But then we know that the reason why Abrams's fear of being too self-conscious about this, very sophisticated fear as he expressed it, doesn't come about, is because we always say to ourselves, like physician, cure thyself. We say, philosopher, cure thyself. But this simply means do more philosophy to get rid of philosophy. Historian, cure thyself. Hayden White is not going to stop writing history. He is going to cure history by writing more history. So this would bring me to one last reflection on the mode of historical discourse, and bring me a little bit towards what I understood Dieter Henrich to be saying, that there is a temporal element which is indissociable, well, that's too strong, which is perhaps very closely tied to the hermeneutic element. He said that history was a sequence of interpretations, and I took it that he meant this on the deep structure as well as on the surface. And when you think of history as a sequence of interpretation, well, you can't have a sequence without it unfolding, as it were. I'm using a metaphor here again, in time, and time just is necessary. Time is necessary in an obvious way for two things. If something seems to be simple or a priori, as Henrik has pointed out, its temporal unfolding, even if it is you that is doing the temporal unfolding by your thoughts, rather than history itself conceived of as apart, a series of actions apart from your doing. Even if it is you who are doing it, you will find in that temporal unfolding contradictions. You problematize it by the very fact that you take the time to unfold it. I think this is just a fact of experience. Then there is the counter element to that, which is, of course, that you try to solve a problem. Often you start, and there I think Henrik was thinking of religious hermeneutics especially, but it is there in secular hermeneutics too. You start with an antinomy or a contradiction in a sacred text, and the only way you can resolve it is by another kind of unfolding, which is in time and which is often narrative, by coordinating two different parts of the text. This may seem like a spatial exercise, of course, but it is not purely that. Or by simply writing your own solution, which as such enters, of course, into a historical flow. So that I think there is a very simple but precise meaning in which history, whether you consider it as Geschichte, that is the events themselves, or history as the activity of your interpretation, is always at one and the same time a temporal and a hermeneutic matter. Let me go for a moment to the status of historical discourse. When we talk about history as a sequence of events, we've already begun to question event and eventualistic history, and that, of course, is not my purpose here. When we go towards that, then there are some very, very, very difficult and interesting questions which I think we haven't really raised, although in a certain devious way I try to raise them in my effort to save the ghost of Geistesgeschichte. That's what I was more or less trying to do, and perhaps, of course, there's a danger of disappearing, like ghosts do, at least to the scientific or to the scholarly mind, when one tries to save the ghosts of the past. Let me go away, though, from my own effort and simply say this, that it's become perhaps more clear to us. We were getting marvelous slide lectures on basically the Napoleonic divide, the post-revolutionary era and its agonies in France. It's become clearer, and you can go to Wordsworth or to many others, that in a sense our notion or our consciousness of ideology, even though it then stretches back into the 17th century and so on, comes very strongly from that era, and you all know what Goethe is reputed to have, what Napoleon is reputed to have said to Goethe about political science is fate. Some say simply politics is fate. Well, perhaps a better translation even is propaganda is fate, because that's what he certainly one aspect of what Napoleon meant. He certainly meant the science of politics in the sense that you have to know how to govern and so on, but he also meant you have to make your power to govern absolutely clear to everyone. In that sense, it involves ideology, it involves massive propaganda, and we saw in some of those pictures that the massive propaganda continued, of course, into the Restoration. And I have a feeling that there's a certain massiveness that comes after Napoleonic era, which reacts against Napoleon, of course, but takes some of his own massiveness into itself. Let me finish by talking about the status of historical discourse in that era. And it seems to me that we need something like what Schiller called aesthetic education about that time, perhaps joined to some kind of historical education. It's the only remedy, is a crude word, but it is the only counter, in a sense, that one has to ideology, and that raises very strongly the question of the status of historical discourse, and perhaps links it to the status of literature and literary discourse.
Thank you very much. I'll throw the meeting open to remarks from the floor. When I recognize you, please identify yourself by name and institution, however eminent you are. Yes, Professor Mills.
Martin Muller, University of Toronto. I've been thinking of two texts that one might consider as the text for which all this has been a commentary. One is Eliot's poem on the addressing of cats, and sometimes I've thought that we've been in search of the third name of the cat, the ineffable one. But the other text is chapter 9 of the Poetics, in which Aristotle brings together three things: history, poetry, which is in effect narrative, and philosophy, with his statement that poetry, narrative, is more philosophical than history, because poetry deals with things such as they might be, hoia angenoito, whereas history deals with what Alcibiades did. And Kurt von Fritz has argued very persuasively that this is very strange, that here Aristotle says that history deals with what Alcibiades did, and not with what Alcibiades did and said. And he says this is a significant omission, and you must see it in the context of the practice of Greek historiographers, that they dealt very differently with the actions of men and with the speeches of men. And that in the genre of Greek historiographers, that is in Thucydides, specifically in Thucydides, what a speaker says may or may not be documentable. It is also in some way something that he might have said, and more often something that he might have said, something that he didn't really say. There is then in Greek historiographers a clear distinction between the reporting of doing and the reporting of saying, and a distinction between saying and doing, which is of course the great Greek distinction of logos and ergon. But this doubles back on itself in a peculiar way, because the act of writing history is in itself a saying. And one might, especially in the light of this conference, look back on any kind of history and say, well, its status as truth is in a peculiar way the kind of very peculiar status of the speeches of Alcibiades in Thucydides' history. And then there's a final reflection. There are facts out there, gritty, nitty, important or not so important. But I often wonder about the Peloponnesian War, this important event which Thucydides described, and of which he said that it was the greatest war that had happened, and it ended tragically with the fall of Athens in 404. And apparently 10 years later they were at it all over again. The armies were bigger, there were more ships, and the ships were bigger, and the money involved was bigger. Then you wonder, what really was the biggest event of the Peloponnesian War by any standard? And they say perhaps the biggest event of the Peloponnesian War was Thucydides' account of it. And I'll leave it at that.
If Professor Hayden White were to raise his hand, I would recognize him. Professor White.
Well, I've learned a great deal from this symposium, largely the most important thing being that I have to write another book, and that I'll start on it with the notes that I've collected here at this symposium. But I would like to say that I note two ambiguities that may be at the center of Professor Cameron's paradox, and one that may help us explain. I need a little chalk. All right. Professor Cameron points out that we're concerned with a historical problem, namely the relationship between Romanticism and historicism. And we're over here somewhere, and we look back on it, utilizing a historical consciousness or a way of looking at history in order to bring it into question, or the very activity of writing history narrating history and so on, which was founded or took shape in the form that we're using it at this time, so there's some kind of circle here. I think that the ambiguities also extend to two words, to narrate, or narration, and history. The first being a Latin root word, which in the Sanskrit root it means to know. This root, and but which we use in a dual sense, right? That is to say, the act of narrating and the thing that results from the act of narrating, namely the text. So we have the text here, and so on, and this writing or speaking here. Now, the interesting thing about the word history is that it means to inquire. And we talk about inquiring into the events and the account of the events. The inquiry into the events, what happened, and the account of the events. Now here I'm getting to the point that you made, I think. Namely, that is to say, the thing produced by the inquiry and the inquiry itself. Now, I think that what I want to say is that we inherit a problem, the problematics of historical knowledge, and it's all wrapped up when we talk about narration in these two senses. We're talking about the form of the narrative that purports to represent the events themselves. I suggest that we have something like this. We imagine a chronicle with these events, and then we can imagine different ways of putting these events together in a verbal icon of them that purports to tell not merely what happened, but what was it. That is to say, when Tocqueville says the real problem is not to relate what happened during the French Revolution, it's to find out whether a revolution really occurred or not. He put the discussion of the revolution on a completely different historical basis. So supposing we say that there are various ways of plotting it, by which you give B prominence, and you get E, F, G. You give A prominence, and you get a kind of deterministic history, some primal crime or a primal scene, E, F. You stress maybe B, or if you're teleologically inclined, you say F. Now, and so on. Now, these represent alternative interpretations of what appear to be the same set of events, but under different modalities of organization of consciousness, and resulting in different narrative accounts with their own formulae, their own syntax, their own grammar, lexicon, and so on. I think that the situation that we're in now is that we want to say something like this, the same way that Kafka would want to do when he frustrates our expectations, or Joyce in Finnegan's Wake. We say, what is history? It's this. You see, you're back to chronicle in some sense, but now you're denying that there's any kind of plot to be found in the events themselves, and this represents the crisis of historicism in some sense, right? That was really, I wrote that book out of an attempt to try to find out how we got into this condition, and with a view to asking how we might get out of it. I don't think we can do it by going back to an early 19th century or any 19th century form of historical representation or consciousness any more than we'd want the novel to recapitulate Jane Austen or Scott or, for that matter, Thomas Mann.
Do I see... I think since it's well after 4 and since there seems to be no forest of hands, we might end with a vote of thanks to Professor Cyrus Hamlin for his organisation and to all of us for being here.